Hi everyone. In this video I will briefly introduce our next unit and our primary text for the next unit, which is this novel by the Laguna Pueblo writer Leslie Marmon Silko. The Laguna Pueblo are people who live in the southwestern part of what we now call the United States, in what we now call the state of New Mexico. And they live in an interconnected sort of community of different tribal nations, including the Navajo and the Ute and other Pueblo peoples. If this is all unfamiliar to you, don't worry. It will become very familiar to you in the course of this unit. I wanted to show you the text in print before we go into our ebooks, because there's some important things to recognize. One thing I wanted to, as you read this in the electronic version, it might seem a little confusing at times. The book is fairly long, right? But it is not written in chapters. It is written in sections. Sometimes there are passages of what look like poetry that represent folk songs and tales and lore from the Laguna Pueblo and sometimes Navajo people that go back by way of oral tradition many generations, hundreds and hundreds of years, and with deeper roots in a deeper past, as we'll explore. At other times, there are spaces between the narrative prose passages that indicate a shift in scene or time, and a shift sometimes in the focus on character. So bear with it. It's not as clear in the ebook version as it is in the print version, unfortunately. So it can be a little confusing at times. I'm going to switch now to a slideshow and run through a really quick summary of how we'll approach this unit, talk a little bit about this novel and how it fits into the consideration of the question of the Anthropocene. This first slide here shows a photo from the 1950s by Lee Marmon, Leslie Marmon Silko, the author of the book, her father, of some ceremonial dancers in the guise of eagles on top of a butte, which is a geological formation, performing a ritual dance. This idea of human and animal or non-human animal relations is very important in this novel and will help us think through some aspects of the question of the Anthropocene that we've begun to think through already. Now, before I get further into the novel, let me note a few things about Essay 2. As you know, it's due tonight, but you may request an extension. Please email me with a request. I know that some of you don't have good internet. It's a rather short deadline. Others of you haven't even had a chance to have a last conversation with me about Taoism and the question of the Anthropocene, and we're not scheduled to have that until Friday. So given all of these difficulties, this is a loose deadline, but why get it in earlier than later? You'll get feedback earlier. I'm going to respond in the order I get these, which means you'll be done with Essay 2 earlier. You'll have your own individual final due date, which will be 1 week after you get my comments. And finally, this is a first draft. And most of the work you'll be doing will come after your first draft, I think, if you're going to do a good job in this essay. So get that first draft in sooner than later, ideally by the deadline. But if you can't, don't stress about it. We will work it out, and I will work with you. Now, back into thinking about ceremony. What you are looking at here is probably quite familiar and also very unfamiliar. You recognize the North American continent, but you don't recognize the way it is represented. That is because we're looking at a map of North America before 1492, before the colonization of the Americas by Europeans. And if we look closely here, we'll be exploring this part of the map, and primarily the Laguna people here. We'll also hear about the Hopi, the Navajo, the Ute, other people who lived in this area. New Mexico, Nevada, Colorado, and Utah in the area known as Four Corners, where those states meet. This question of colonization and the deep history of the Americas in relation to European settlers, and also the intermingling of cultures and of people is a big part of ceremony, as you'll see. It's also a big part of the question of the Anthropocene, as you will see. A little bit of background on Leslie Marmon Silko. It was first published in 1977 in this edition. Here is a picture of her back then, and here she is more recently. As you can see, it's been published in many editions. Here we see, again, representations of the Eagle Dance. Here is Leslie Marmon Silko's father, Lee Marmon, in 1950 with his camera. And he's notable for documenting the daily life of the Laguna people, the Laguna Pueblo people. By the way, when we're talking about the people in this novel, let's try to be very specific and call them Laguna Pueblo, or if we have somebody who is Navajo, say Navajo. These are new words for many of you, but it's much better than just trying to say something like, quote-unquote, Indians or Native Americans, right? It's a little bit like if we just talk about Asians, but we actually mean Koreans, but we just say Asians. Or if we're talking about Chinese and we just say Asians, right? Let's be more precise and accurate. Here we see some ceremonial dancers. We'll talk about some of this iconography, some of the symbolism here moving forward. Here is an old Laguna Pueblo woman. There are characters in the novel that we'll encounter who would look just like this. Here are some men. Here's a buffalo dance. Note the horns. Here's an old man, another old man with his Chuck Taylor sneakers and his cigar. And here's Leslie Marmon Silko's father with that photograph in a gallery. So we're getting this picture here visually of the world we're entering, but it's not just this world, as you'll see. This goes back a ways. This would be more prior to the period of time in the novel. Here we see Laguna, New Mexico, and this is why we call this style of building Pueblo. You might have heard that before. It's a style of building that is prevalent in this part of what's now the United States for many hundreds of years prior to the arrival of Europeans. Here's the Laguna Pueblo reservation on a snowy day, and we'll be reading about this place in the novel. Note here the church, Christianity, Catholicism coming from the Spanish conquistadores, and then later Christianity coming through Anglo-American and other European settlers plays a big role in the novel too, in tension with traditional native belief systems, as we'll see. Another big part of this novel to think about that we'll explore is that this is set right after World War II, but the main character, a young man named Tayo, who is half Pueblo, half white. His father was a white man, who he doesn't ever know, who leaves, right? This main character, Tayo, fought in World War II. He went to the Pacific and fought in the U.S. Army, and he experienced some really hard things, along with his brother, Rocky, who is actually his cousin, but they grew up as brothers. They fought in the Philippines. They were captured by the Japanese and participated in something called the Bataan Death March. And they were prisoners of war until the end. They also Tayo indirectly believes he experienced the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is a passage from the novel that we'll get. You can go ahead and read it now, but you can get a sense of the contrast between the old-time beliefs of the Laguna Pueblo people. Here, an old man like one we just saw in those photos is trying to help Tayo, who is suffering from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. He went through hell in the war and comes back and has a really hard time integrating back into daily life in New Mexico, right? And so here we can see this passage that is talking about ultimately the atomic bomb, this final scene, and the man's name is Kush. Hush would have looked at the dismembered corpses and the atomic heat flash outlines where human bodies had evaporated, and the old man would have said something close and terrible had killed these people. Not even old-time witches killed like that. So here we see modern warfare technology through the lens of this old man's perception of the world, which is rooted in traditional Pueblo lore and belief. Here we see some Navajo soldiers from World War II. So when you're looking and thinking about Tayo and Rocky, they might have looked a lot like these guys. They would have. You can see here, two of them are dressed in their traditional warrior garb. These are men who fought in or participated in World War II. Here is a scene from the Bataan Death March. There aren't many photographs of it, but these are soldiers captured by the Japanese. You can see an injured man being helped along. Here is a photo of those same, I believe these might be soldiers captured in Singapore. And here you can see them carrying effectively bodies as they are forced to march across a very rough terrain to their prisoner of war camp. And this is how they looked at the end of the experience, those who survived. So Tayo goes through this. This is part of his trauma. Another part of the novel that's important for us to understand is the role of the atomic bomb. It's not just that it was detonated in Japan, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but that it was tested in New Mexico. The Trinity test, the first detonation of a nuclear weapon, plays a big role in the novel, as does the fact that Laguna is part of the region in which uranium was mined as in the 1950s and the 1960s and ongoing, in a way that's poisoned many of the lands of these people, the Navajo, the Laguna, and that also is part of what we could call the nuclear industrial complex. Extraction of uranium, processing it into weapons-grade uranium or plutonium to make bombs, and also nuclear power, right? So here's the mushroom cloud of that first test. This is from Hiroshima, or I believe, if not Nagasaki, and this is a human being who was vaporized by the atomic heat flash and whose shadow was burned into the pavement. So if you think about that passage with old-time witches, this is what they're talking about. So that's the end of part 1 of today's 2-part video lecture. Part 2 will go into how we can read this novel in the context of the Anthropocene.